Blake and Mason had always been more than just neighborhood friends. There was a subtle chemistry between them, something that was never spoken out loud but felt in the air whenever they were together. Blake, at 18, was full of energy, with light brown hair, athletic build, and expressive brown eyes. Mason, at 30, had a commanding presence with his muscular physique, dark hair, and steady brown eyes. He was the kind of person who made any place feel interesting. When Mason invited Blake to spend a weekend at his country house, Blake felt a thrill he couldn't quite explain. He accepted the invitation immediately, excited for what a quiet, secluded weekend might bring. Upon arriving, Blake was greeted by Mason, who was waiting outside, leaning against the wooden porch with a smile on his face, ready to enjoy a relaxing weekend. Or maybe not so relaxing, Mason teased, his eyes glinting with a hint of mischief. Absolutely. This place is amazing, Blake replied, letting himself be swept up in Mason's energy. The day flew by as they explored the property and exchanged glances that lingered a second too long. The connection between them was palpable, a tension that seemed to build with every passing moment. When the sun began to set and the air grew cooler, they returned inside. Mason suggested lighting a fire, and the two settled down on the floor, the warmth from the flames filling the room. As they talked about life, dreams, and experiences, both of them knew that this weekend promised more than just relaxation in the countryside. The crackling of the fireplace filled the room as night fell deeper around the country house. Blake and Mason sat on the floor, talking with the kind of ease only close friends share. But there was something different about this moment. It felt like the physical distance between them was too small to contain the connection they shared. "So, what were you hoping for this weekend, Blake?" Mason asked, his intense gaze fixed on his friend. Blake hesitated, a nervous smile forming on his face. "I wanted something different," he replied, trying to hide how intrigued he felt by Mason's presence. Mason leaned a little closer, his brown eyes shining in the firelight. "Well, I think we can make it unforgettable, don't you?" His voice, low and steady, sent a shiver down Blake's spine. It was an unspoken promise, understood without needing words. Blake's heart raced, but he didn't look away. The closeness between them became almost electrifying, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The sounds of the fire and the wind outside were only a distant backdrop to the intensity that enveloped them both. The night had only just begun, but they both knew that this weekend in the country would be far more than just a visit between friends. The next morning, Blake woke up to the gentle sunlight streaming through the guest room window, warming the room. The country house was completely quiet, except for the distant sound of birds outside. He stretched, feeling the fresh, clean air coming through the slightly open window. For a moment, it all felt like a dream. When he went downstairs, he found Mason in the kitchen, already making breakfast. With a simple t-shirt and slightly messy hair, Mason looked incredibly comfortable, as if he was right where he belonged. "Did you sleep well?" he asked with a relaxed smile. Blake nodded, still feeling the calm of the morning, but he noticed that the effect Mason had on him only grew stronger. After breakfast, Mason suggested a walk along the trail surrounding the property. As they walked, they chatted about everything and nothing at the same time, but each glance and accidental touch intensified the tension between them. At one point, while admiring the view from a hilltop, Mason turned to Blake, and the silence between them seemed to say it all. "It's beautiful here," Blake said, but his voice came out soft, almost a whisper. Mason looked at him closely, a mysterious sparkle in his eyes. "It's not just the place that's beautiful," he replied, his voice calm and gentle. Blake felt his face warm, but he didn't look away. They stood there, side by side, in a moment that felt suspended in time. The landscape around them became just a backdrop to the intensity that now surrounded them completely. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shared moments. Blake and Mason returned from the walk, their light-hearted conversations filled with glances that spoke louder than words. The country house seemed to conspire to bring them even closer, with its cozy atmosphere and the privacy that the remote location provided. That night, Mason suggested a simple dinner on the porch, where the night sky was a spectacle of shimmering stars. Sitting at the table, they both relaxed, laughing and exchanging childhood stories, memories that brought a genuine closeness. But there was something more hanging in the air, an electricity that made every moment more intense. After dinner, Mason brought out a bottle of wine, pouring a glass for each of them. They sat side by side in silence, just enjoying each other's company. The atmosphere was calm, but every detail seemed loaded with meaning. Blake felt his heart race when, in a natural gesture, Mason rested his hand on his, a light touch, but one that carried an unspoken promise. Without a word, they looked at each other, and in that instant, the barrier between friendship and something more dissolved completely. The night was quiet, the cool country air bringing a sense of peace and freedom that seemed to dissolve any hesitation. Sitting side by side, Blake and Mason kept exchanging looks, as if discovering something new about each other every second. Mason's hand was still on Blake's, and that simple touch was all they needed to feel the weight of the moment. Without saying a word, Mason leaned in slightly, his eyes searching Blake's, seeking permission. Blake felt his heart speed up, but he didn't hesitate. He knew that this moment was meant to happen, as if everything had led them here. When they finally moved closer, the world around them disappeared. The connection between them was undeniable, each gesture filled with meaning. The night continued as they explored this new discovery, in a silence that spoke louder than any words. That night, they realized that the weekend in the country was far more than just a friendly visit. The next morning arrived quietly, with the soft sunlight filling the country house. Blake woke up slowly, remembering the moments he had shared with Mason the night before. Every detail was still fresh in his mind, and he felt a mix of excitement and calm, as if everything had finally fallen into place. He went down to the kitchen, where he found Mason making breakfast with a peaceful smile. The energy between them felt different now, marked by the understanding of something they had discovered together. "Did you sleep well?" Mason asked, his voice soft with a hint of humor. Blake smiled, moving closer. "Better than I expected," he replied. The atmosphere was comfortable and intimate, as if they were the only two people in the world. After breakfast, they decided to explore more of the property, walking along trails that led to hidden corners of the land. At every pause, a new smile, a new look filled with meaning. In the silence of the countryside, their feelings expressed themselves in a pure way, unhurried, and the day passed in a peacefulness that made every moment even more special. Blake knew that those days in the country house would be unforgettable, and that, no matter what came next, he would carry each second of this discovery with him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting warm hues of orange and pink across the sky. Blake and Mason found themselves back in the kitchen, side by side, preparing dinner together. The soft clinks of dishes and utensils mixed with their quiet laughter, creating a rhythm that felt almost like a dance. The ease between them was palpable, a natural harmony that seemed to have grown over the weekend, deepening with each shared look, each gentle brush of their hands as they passed one another in the small kitchen space. Blake couldn't help but steal glances at Mason as he chopped vegetables or moved around the room with a casual confidence. There was something captivating about watching him here, in his element, where every movement seemed so intentional yet effortless. Mason, with his broad shoulders and easy smile, felt both strong and comforting. In that moment, Blake realized how much he had come to admire him, not just for his looks or his strength, but for the quiet confidence and warmth that Mason carried with him. As they worked, their conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from light-hearted jokes to deeper reflections. Blake found himself opening up about dreams he'd never spoken of before, childhood memories, and even insecurities he'd kept hidden. Mason listened with an attentiveness that made Blake feel truly seen, truly understood. It was rare to find someone who could listen so well, someone who could make him feel safe enough to share every part of himself. When dinner was finally ready, they carried their plates out to the porch, where the fading sunlight cast a gentle glow over everything. They ate in comfortable silence, letting the sounds of the countryside fill the air around them. Blake found himself glancing at Mason every now and then, catching him looking back, each smile exchanged feeling like a silent promise. After the meal, Mason poured them each a glass of wine, and they leaned back, watching as the stars began to emerge one by one. There, under the vastness of the night sky, Blake felt a peacefulness that was rare for him, as if the entire world had slowed down, leaving only this moment, this connection between them. Without thinking, Blake reached over and placed his hand on Mason's, feeling the warmth of his skin against his own. Mason turned to him, his expression soft but intense. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, the world around them fading into the background. "You know," Mason began, his voice low, "I didn't expect this weekend to feel so important." Blake nodded, his own emotions mirroring Mason's. "I feel the same way," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." Mason's fingers tightened slightly around Blake's hand, and they stayed like that, in a silence that felt full of unspoken words and shared understanding. As the night deepened, they sat close together, feeling the warmth of each other's presence. Blake realized that his feelings had grown beyond a simple attraction. This was something deeper, something that felt real and lasting. And as he leaned his head on Mason's shoulder, he knew that whatever came next, this weekend had changed him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The morning arrived with a bittersweet clarity, as sunlight filtered gently through the windows of the country house, casting a warm glow over everything it touched. Blake awoke with a sense of calm, yet he could feel the subtle ache of knowing this would be his last day here. He lingered for a moment, letting the silence and warmth of the bed wrap around him, holding on to the last remnants of the weekend. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted through the air, leading him to the kitchen where Mason was already preparing breakfast. Blake paused in the doorway, watching Mason move with a quiet ease that seemed to fill the space. There was something so genuine, so steady about him that it made Blake's heart tighten. Mason looked up and smiled as Blake entered, his gaze warm and filled with a sense of peace. "Good morning," Mason greeted, handing him a cup of coffee. "Figured I'd make breakfast for our last day here." His tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable depth behind his words, a shared understanding that this weekend had changed everything between them. They sat down at the table, their conversation flowing as naturally as the quiet countryside around them. There was laughter, shared glances, and a palpable warmth that neither wanted to break. Every gesture, every word felt meaningful, like a memory they were storing away for the time when they would be apart. Once breakfast was over, they decided to take one last walk around the property. The sun was higher now, casting a bright golden light across the fields. As they strolled through the familiar paths, each turn and view became a reminder of the moments they'd shared. They walked in comfortable silence side by side, occasionally stealing glances at each other, each one filled with an unspoken promise. When they reached the edge of the lake, Mason paused, looking out at the water before turning to Blake. "I want you to know something," he said softly, his gaze steady. "This weekend, it was more than I could have asked for. I didn't realize how much I needed it, or you." Blake felt his heart swell at Mason's words, the sincerity behind them. "I feel the same," he replied, his voice quiet but certain. "Being here with you, it's been more than I expected. And leaving, it feels harder than I thought it would be." They stood there for a while, letting the weight of their words settle between them. When they finally made their way back to the house, there was a sense of understanding that hung in the air, a promise that this connection wouldn't end when they left. As they packed up and prepared to leave, Blake felt a mixture of emotions he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just saying goodbye to a weekend away. He was leaving behind a piece of himself that he knew would forever be tied to this place and to Mason. At the door, they shared one last embrace, the kind of hug that spoke volumes, holding on to each other as though to delay the inevitable goodbye. When they finally pulled apart, Mason's gaze held an unspoken reassurance. "This isn't the end, Blake. We'll find a way to keep this." Blake nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I know." And with one last lingering look, he turned and walked to his car, feeling Mason's eyes on him until he drove away, carrying the memory of the weekend and a newfound hope for whatever lay ahead. The drive back to the city was filled with a quiet intensity. Blake found himself replaying each moment from the weekend, each smile, each touch, each shared silence. It was as if every memory held a piece of him, and he wasn't quite sure how to leave it all behind. His phone buzzed as he neared the city limits, and he glanced down to see a message from Mason. "Let's not make this our last weekend together." A smile broke across Blake's face as he read the message. It was simple, yet it carried the promise he had been hoping for. Over the next few weeks, they kept in touch, exchanging messages and late-night phone calls. The days felt lighter, their conversations a reminder of the connection that had sparked so naturally between them. It was more than just the memories of that weekend. It was the start of something real, something worth nurturing. Finally, one Friday evening, Blake received another message from Mason. "How about a visit to the city this time? Let's make some new memories." The invitation sent a thrill through him, and he quickly replied, eager for the chance to see Mason again. The anticipation built as the weekend approached, and when Mason finally arrived, It was as if no time had passed. They fell into an easy rhythm, exploring the city together, sharing laughs and quiet moments. They discovered new favorite spots, hidden corners of the city that held their own charm, creating memories that were just as meaningful as those in the country. One evening, as they sat on Blake's balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, Mason reached over, taking Blake's hand in his. "This feels like the beginning of something good," he murmured, his gaze warm and steady. "Something we both need." Blake looked over at him, his heart full. "I think it is," he replied, a sense of certainty settling over him. In that moment, he realized that what they had was more than just a fleeting connection. It was real, something that had taken root and grown beyond the confines of a single weekend. They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing dreams for the future, hopes that were no longer just individual aspirations, but ones they could imagine sharing together. The city, the country, it didn't matter where they were. They had found something rare, something worth holding on to, and they both knew they would find a way to make it last. As the night drew on, they stayed close, the promise of a shared future bringing them a quiet joy. Blake knew that whatever challenges came their way, they had already found something irreplaceable in each other,